Something unexpected has just unfolded at the center of global politics. In a moment that stunned reporters and caught even seasoned analysts off guard, Donald Trump abruptly walked out during a high-stakes exchange. Just seconds after a calculated intervention by Mark Carney, the room fell silent, cameras kept rolling, and within minutes, the story began spreading across international media channels. This is not just another tense political moment. It could signal a deeper shift in how power is being negotiated behind closed doors and how economic influence is now intersecting with political authority in ways we have not seen before. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine interaction, a scheduled appearance, a controlled environment, questions expected, answers prepared, but what unfolded was anything but routine. Trump, known for his direct and often confrontational style, had entered the room with visible confidence. The tone was steady, controlled, even predictable. But then came a line of questioning, and more importantly, a strategic response that changed everything. Carney, a figure not typically associated with dramatic political theater, delivered a remark that insiders are now calling unexpectedly precise. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it was calculated, and it landed. Within seconds, Trump's posture shifted, his expression tightened. There's a pause, brief but noticeable, and then without completing the exchange, he stood up and exited. No closing statement, no attempt to redirect, just silence and departure. But this is where the situation becomes more serious, because this was not simply about one comment or one reaction. It was about timing, context, and the growing tension between economic leadership and political authority on the global stage. To understand why this moment matters, we need to step back. Over the past several months, there has been a subtle but undeniable shift in global dynamics. Economic figures, central bankers, financial strategists, policy architects have begun to take on a more visible and assertive role in shaping political conversations, and few represent that shift more clearly than Mark Carney. Carney is not a conventional politician. His influence has historically come from financial institutions, from his leadership roles at the Bank of Canada and later at the Bank of England. His expertise lies in markets, stability, and long-term economic forecasting. But in recent years, his voice has expanded beyond traditional economic boundaries. He's spoken more directly about global risks and that political instability, about the intersection of policy and financial resilience. And that is precisely what makes this moment so significant, because when someone like Carney steps into a conversation with someone like Trump, the dynamics are fundamentally different. Trump operates through direct communication, clear messaging, and strong positioning. His approach is rooted in political momentum and public perception. Carney operates through precision, data, long-term implications. His approach is quieter, but often deeper. And when those two styles collide, the outcome is rarely simple. Now, here is the detail many people are missing. This exchange did not happen in isolation. In the weeks leading up to this moment, there have been growing discussions around global economic pressures, inflation concerns, trade uncertainties, shifts in central bank policies, and behind all of that, a broader question. Who is really steering the direction of the global system? Political leaders or economic architects. Carney has increasingly positioned himself as someone willing to address that question directly, not through confrontation, but through framing, through language that reframes the conversation itself. So when he responded during that exchange, it was not just an answer, it was a signal that the economic narrative may no longer be secondary to the political one, and this changes the entire political equation. Because for decades, political figures have dominated the public stage while economic decision makers operated behind the scenes, quietly, indirectly, influencing outcomes without becoming the story themselves. But that boundary is now shifting, and Trump's reaction, whether intentional or instinctive, may reflect a deeper recognition of that shift. To understand how we reached this point, we need to examine the timeline. So this did not begin today or even this week. It has been building, and over the past year, global markets have experienced periods of volatility that many analysts initially described as temporary, but those fluctuations have persisted and in some cases intensified. Central banks around the world have adjusted interest rates, governments have introduced new policies, but the results have been mixed. Uncertainty remains. And in times of uncertainty, voices like Carney's tend to gain influence, not because they seek attention, but because they offer frameworks, explanations, a sense of structure in an unpredictable environment. At the same time, political narratives have become more polarized, messaging has become sharper, positions more rigid, and that creates friction because economic analysis often requires nuance and flexibility, long-term thinking, while political communication often demands clarity, certainty, immediate impact. When those two approaches intersect, tension is almost inevitable. That this is where the situation becomes more serious, because what happened in that room may not have been a spontaneous reaction. Some analysts are now suggesting that Carney's intervention was strategically timed, that it was designed not just to respond, but to challenge, not aggressively, but structurally, to introduce a perspective that would be difficult to dismiss without acknowledgement, and that creates a dilemma, because ignoring such a perspective can appear evasive, but engaging with it requires shifting the narrative. And in high-stakes environments, even a small shift can have significant consequences. Trump's decision to leave, whether viewed as a rejection, a tactical move, or a moment of frustration, has now become part of that narrative, and narratives matter. And they shape perception, influence markets, guide political responses. Now, here is the detail many people are missing. The reaction from reporters. Those present described the atmosphere as unusually tense, not chaotic, not loud, but controlled in a way that made the moment more striking. Because when experienced journalists are surprised, it usually means something has broken from the expected pattern. And that is exactly what happened. The expected pattern would have been a verbal exchange, a counter-argument, a redirection. Instead, there was a pause and then an exit. And that pause is now being analyzed as much as the action itself, because in that pause, something shifted. And this changes the entire political equation because it raises questions about strategy. Was this a calculated disengagement, a refusal to validate a particular line of discussion? Or was it a moment where the balance of the conversation shifted unexpectedly? To answer that, we need to look at the motivations of the key players. Trump's approach has always been rooted in control of the narrative and maintaining momentum, staying ahead of the conversation. Walking out can, in some contexts, reinforce that control. It can signal rejection, authority, finality, but it can also create space for interpretation. And interpretation is where influence begins to shift. Carney, on the other hand, operates differently. His influence comes from credibility, from consistency, from the perception that his statements are grounded in analysis rather than reaction. So when he speaks, and particularly when he speaks in a moment like this, the impact is often amplified by that perception, not because of volume, but because of weight. But this is where the situation becomes more serious, because the intersection of these two approaches is now being watched closely by global observers. Financial markets are sensitive to signals, even subtle ones. Political systems are sensitive to perception, even indirect shifts. And when a moment captures when it reflects both economic and political tension, it becomes more than just a headline. It becomes a reference point. Now, here's a detail many people are missing. This may not be the last such moment. In fact, some analysts believe it could be the beginning of a new phase where economic figures take on a more active role in shaping public political discourse, not as politicians, but as participants. And that changes the landscape because it introduces a new layer of complexity, a new set of voices, a new set of dynamics, and this changes the entire political equation. So because it means that future interactions may not follow traditional patterns, they may be less predictable, more nuanced, more interconnected. And as the story continues to unfold, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. What happened in that room was not just a reaction, it was a signal that the balance between political authority and economic influence is shifting, and the world is watching closely to see what happens next. Thus, the immediate images from that moment are still circulating, still being replayed, still being analyzed frame by frame. But beyond the visuals, beyond the silence and the sudden exit, the deeper implications are now beginning to surface. Because what happened was not just a disruption of a conversation, it was a disruption of alignment between political authority and economic signaling. And when that alignment weakens, even briefly, the consequences can extend far beyond a single room. From a strategic perspective, this moment sits at the intersection of three powerful forces: political messaging, economic credibility, and institutional trust. For political leaders like Donald Trump, maintaining control over the narrative is not simply about communication, it is about stability. Markets respond to tone, allies respond to consistency, opponents respond to perceived weakness or unpredictability. An abrupt exit, particularly in response to a structured economic challenge, introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity is rarely neutral. It invites interpretation. At the same time, figures like Mark Carney operate within a different strategic framework. Their influence is derived not from electoral mandate, but from institutional trust, from their ability to interpret complex systems and communicate risk in a way that markets and policymakers take seriously. So when Carney speaks in a public setting, and especially when his words appear to alter the direction of an exchange, it is not just a comment. It is a signal to multiple audiences at once: investors, governments, central banks, and international institutions. And this is where the global stakes become clearer, because signals in today's interconnected system travel quickly, faster than official statements, faster than formal policy changes. A moment like this can be interpreted in financial markets before it is even fully explained in political circles. If investors perceive tension between political leadership and economic expertise, they may begin to adjust expectations. Risk premiums can shift, currency movements can accelerate, long-term projections can be recalibrated. Even without a single policy change, perception alone can influence direction. But the real risk may still lie ahead, because beyond markets, there are legal and institutional dimensions to consider. Carney's background connects into global regulatory frameworks, financial stability boards, central banking networks, international advisory groups. His statements are rarely isolated. They often reflect broader conversations happening within those systems. If his intervention was aligned with a wider concern about economic policy direction, fiscal sustainability, or systemic risk, then this moment could represent more than a personal exchange. It could reflect an emerging institutional position, and that introduces a different level of complexity, because when institutional concerns begin to surface in public discourse, they can lead to formal responses, reviews, policy adjustments, even coordinated action among central banks or regulatory bodies. And this is where the global stakes become clearer. International actors are already watching. In Europe, financial policymakers have been navigating their own set of challenges: growth pressures, inflation dynamics, energy transitions. Stability depends on predictability, particularly for major global economies. In Asia, where export-driven systems are highly sensitive to shifts in global demand and currency stability, signals from Western political and economic interactions are closely monitored. In emerging markets, where capital flows can be more volatile, even subtle changes in global confidence can have immediate effects. So when a moment like this occurs, when a high-profile political figure disengages in response to an economic intervention, it is not viewed in isolation. It is integrated into a broader assessment of global risk. Now, analysts are quietly warning about another possibility that this could influence diplomatic positioning, because economic credibility and political stability are often intertwined in international negotiations. Trade agreements, security alliances, multilateral initiatives all depend, to some extent, on confidence and leadership consistency. If partners perceive unpredictability, they may adjust their strategies, not openly, not immediately, but gradually. They may seek alternative alignments, diversify dependencies, strengthen regional frameworks, and those shifts over time can reshape the balance of influence. But there is one final factor that could change everything, an overlooked connection that is now beginning to draw attention: the relationship between public economic discourse and private institutional strategy. Carney's role historically has involved not just public communication, but behind-the-scenes coordination, aligning central banks and advising on systemic risk, and participating in global financial architecture. If his public remarks in that moment were connected, even indirectly, to ongoing institutional discussions, then the implications extend beyond what was said on camera. They point to a deeper layer of alignment among economic actors, and that layer is not always visible. It operates through consensus, through shared analysis, through coordinated timing. So when a figure like Carney introduces a particular framing in a public setting, it may reflect a broader convergence of views within those networks. And this changes the entire context of the exchange, because it suggests that the tension observed was not just between two individuals, but between two systems of influence: political authority on one side, institutional economic signaling on the other. Now, looking forward, analysts are beginning to outline possible scenarios. The first is stabilization. In this scenario, the moment is contained, clarifications are issued, messaging is adjusted. Both political and economic actors recalibrate their communication to restore alignment. Markets absorb the event without significant disruption. International partners interpret it as a temporary divergence rather than a structural shift. This would require coordinated effort, careful language, consistent signaling, and perhaps behind-the-scenes dialogue to ensure that future interactions remain controlled. But the real risk may still lie ahead, because the second scenario is divergence. In this case, the moment becomes part of a pattern. Similar interactions follow. Tensions between political messaging and economic analysis become more visible. Investors begin to factor in uncertainty. Institutions become more cautious. International partners adjust their expectations. Over time, this divergence could lead to fragmented signaling, where political statements and economic indicators point in different directions. And that creates complexity, not immediate crisis, but increased volatility, reduced clarity, slower decision-making. And this is where the global stakes become clearer, because the third scenario is transformation. So in this scenario, the balance between political and economic influence shifts more fundamentally. Economic figures, central bankers, policy advisors, institutional leaders take on a more prominent role in public discourse, not replacing political leadership, but complementing it in a more visible way. This could lead to a new model of governance communication, one where economic analysis is integrated more directly into political messaging. More transparency, more technical language, more emphasis on long-term frameworks, but also potentially more complexity for public audiences to navigate. Now, analysts are quietly warning about another possibility, that these scenarios are not mutually exclusive. Elements of each could emerge simultaneously, stabilization in some areas, divergence in others, gradual transformation over time. And that makes the situation more difficult to predict because it is not a single trajectory. It is a set of overlapping dynamics. But there is one final factor that could change everything: time, and how quickly this moment is followed by another, how consistently similar patterns appear, how effectively institutions and leaders respond. Because in global systems, timing is often as important as substance. A single event can be absorbed. A series of events can redefine expectations. And as this story continues to evolve, the focus is shifting from what happened to what happens next. The exit itself is no longer the central question. The central question is what it represents: a moment of tension, a signal of divergence, or the early stage of a broader shift in global dynamics. Because if it is the latter, then the implications extend far beyond this single exchange. They touch on how decisions are made, how risks are communicated, how power is balanced between political authority and economic expertise, and ultimately how the global system adapts to a changing environment. So as we look ahead, one thing remains clear: moments like this do not exist in isolation. They are part of a pattern that is still forming, still evolving, still being interpreted in real time. And the world is watching, not just for reactions, but for direction, because direction in times like these defines outcomes. And the question that now remains is this: are we witnessing a temporary disruption in communication or the early signs of a deeper realignment in global power? That's